Hi, this is Randy Randall of No Age and host of the podcast Hyphenate with Randy Randall. I want to welcome our newest sponsor of the show, DistroKid. DistroKid helps musicians get their music on all the major streaming platforms, and artists keep 100% of their royalties. Hyphenate listeners get 30% off at distrokid.com/VIP/hyphenate. Again, that's distrokid.com/VIP/HYPHENATE. Go get your music streaming everywhere now.
So I hope we all bandy together today and come out, as a smarter country that can, I sort of go forward and not have, this thing where we're really trying to undo the progress of the last 100 years and put the power of society in the hands of people who are almost comic book villains.
Wow. All right. Welcome to Hyphenate with me, your host, Randy Randall. There you have a prescient quote from today's guest, JC Gabel from Hat and Beard Press. We spoke on the day of the election day last week, and it's a interesting conversation, I think, looking back now, just a week later. And sort of the news that has begun to explode and, sort of whatever is coming on the horizon here. I really am glad I got to speak with JC. This is week 2 of our independent publishers month of November. I love seeing everybody's responses to the first episode with Clint Woodside from Deadbeat Club Press and Coffee. I hope everybody got some coffee, got a good coffee subscription going. I think my wife and I just went through the first 2 bags. I might have to double up our order. I think we went through those 2 bags in about a week. So I thought those 2 bags might hold us over for the month, but I think we're gonna need a bigger coffee subscription. But it was really great interacting with so many great people around Clint's episode. And here is week 2, my conversation with JC Gabel. He is a very lugubrious talker. I'm looking at the waveform here of the interview that's about to come, and he can talk. And I knew this. I knew JC. I knew he would talk, but it's really great. And it's a very interesting, insightful, political, very, some tangents, but really, really thoughtful. And this is 2 people, looking back and looking forward on what could happen, if the election went the way that it went. So, we did not know at the time, which way the election was going to go. I think we recorded this about 10 a.m. the morning of the election. And, we get into all things, Hat and Beard and everything else too. But, obviously it was hard to ignore the elephant in the room. And I think, obviously I've not waffled, but I've contemplated, sort of what is the role of the podcast, and I don't want to be a doomsayer. Everything's terrible, but there's a lot of terrible things, and there's things that need to be acknowledged. And I think having a voice in a public place like this is, I want to be able to, I think just sort of work through the social and psychological sort of ills and things that I'm feeling personally. Maybe you're feeling some similar things. And again, not that this is a form of therapy or anything, but I always get a lot out of doing these podcasts and talking with my guests, and even just, kind of talking up front and after these things. I feel like it is a way for me to sort of get out whatever I'm feeling inside. So I appreciate everyone who listens and who reaches out and supports the show. But it's a weird time. And I think we're all probably, oscillating between all these different cycles of grief. I really feel like this is something on the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, process of grieving. I think for people who are thoughtful and, kind of understand that this was not the dream, and not even knowing if the other way was a dream either, but at least just to stave off some sort of sense of fascism and racism and empowerment within the culture. But, I don't know. With all that being said, I don't want it to be a pity party. I don't want it to be a downer thing. I want us to be able to, share and laugh and have conversations and express ourselves. And there's, a place of dialogue and discourse and some solace. At least that's what I'm getting out of it. That's kind of how I'm using these interviews, especially this month, and talking to all these great independent book publishers. And sort of highlighting, what is important in the world and how to support those things that you believe in and still believe in and continue to believe in and support and do things, and hopefully empower artists and creatives and free thinkers and champion those avenues of expression. I think that's a big place. At least that's where I live. I guess, maybe I'm biased because I see that within my life and how much the arts and music, visual arts, performance arts, conceptual art, authors, all of these things have really influenced my life and allowed me to sort of come to my decisions and question decisions that had been made or question the world around me and sort of just find myself in the world and where I fit in the world. I think I've done that through interacting with art and creative endeavors, whether, reading them, listening to them, and then finding my own space in that environment and giving something back via the bands and the other artwork and film and now podcasting. So, this is sort of to serve as a dialogue. As much as today's conversation is a dialogue. Yeah, I appreciate everybody sticking with me and going through this, and I appreciate everyone that reaches out on Instagram and at hyphenatehalftime@gmail.com. This is the way we're going to do it. It's community driven, community focused, and these are the conversations I have with people that are part of my community, and I share them with you. That hopefully you're part of my community as well, or you're part of your community, and I can somehow play a small role in that. I think it's where change happens. It's where processing happens, processing emotions, going through things. We don't have to do this alone. We are all very social animals, whether we like it or not. As human beings, we gather around campfires and tell each other stories and listen to what's going on in the day and share what went on in our day. And this somehow gets us through another day. So that's part of what I think, this podcast serves, especially for people. I think for me, when I first really, went all the way in on podcasting through the pandemic, it really felt like those moments of isolation, not going to shows, not going to as many live events as I had for most of my life. I found some solace in the conversations that people were having in the podcast space. So that's, this is sort of me repaying that debt and how much that got me through, and also hopefully being able to provide a space for other people to get them through whatever they're going through and not feel so alone in the world. But yeah, I'm very happy with this conversation we have. Again, it may feel a little naive because not knowing what we knew, about the world. It was sort of a conversation of on the precipice, what's going to happen. There's hope and there's fears and all of those things. But I think it's interesting to document and to share. And I really appreciate JC taking the time, especially on a day like Election Day, to sit and talk with me and tell me his story of his journey to independent publishing. And you can find out more and buy books. More importantly, I guess, find out, but also go pick up some great titles that JC has at hatandbeard.com. You can also go to his Instagram, which is at hatandbeardpress. Follow him on all the socials. Just Google Hat and Beard Press. He's everywhere in there. He's probably printed matter. Yeah, you can find the Hat and Beard books out in the world. We talk about that and get into the Amazon sphere and the other larger economic considerations for DIY and independent publishers like JC. And then, the next week I have another great guest, my friend Brian Ray and Dorothy Perret to end it all there. So 4 weeks, 4 great authors, designers, publishers, and that'll get us into December, and I got lots more other fun, wacky stuff to talk about. But thought it was important, just in this sort of world post-election to share these stories and to highlight independent publishers, as well as supporting them and encouraging people to go out and buy books from independent publishers and buy them from them directly. As you'll hear in the talk with JC, that supporting great artists is always a call, but, buying directly from the publishers is a great thing to do. And you really, your money goes straight back into them publishing more books. No one here is becoming millionaires, but there are independent publishers and they support alternative voices and artists and document important things for archive purposes, for all things going around. We get into that a little bit with some of the publishers about the immediacy of, online digital publishing and journalism, but there is something about the long term of paper and between covers and ink on paper that has a lasting impact that I think it's important to not lose sight of. So, think of that this holiday season when you're thinking about what to buy for your friends and family. Buy them a book. It's a gift that keeps on giving. All right, here we go. Without further ado, here goes JC. Strap in. JC, thanks for jumping on Hyphenate. How you doing, man? What's going on?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we won't get into the particulars, but it's the election day and we're having a fateful day.
We can say, we're recording on election day. We don't know what's going to happen. This will air much after the election day, probably a couple of weeks. But what a wild time in American history, right? I mean,
I think, weirdly, I was looking at my notebooks that go back 20 years, 25 years, and it's like I've always worked in some sort of publishing apparatus that is part of the counterculture. And weirdly, it thrives when we have tyrannical governments, and, obviously that's a horrible thing to say and out loud, but it is kind of true. And like that, obviously I don't want, who to win and I'm fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But it is interesting to see that like the last gasp, for instance, of like independent magazines were kind of during the George W. Bush years. And like, once we got to Obama, someone said to me the other day, like, when did you know it was time to stop doing a magazine? And I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but ours winded down in 2009. And for listeners who don't know, I used to run a magazine called Stop Smiling, the magazine for high-minded lowlifes, for about 15 years. But I mean, this would be sort of interesting to, music heads would also appreciate this. Like, I didn't see it at the time, but hindsight can be 20/20. But looking back, I think what killed most of the alternative weeklies and most of the print magazines in the country that were independent was YouTube came out. 6 months later, Facebook came out. 6 months later, or 9 months later, whatever. Might not have the exact timeline right. Then we had the 2008 financial crash. And those three things, which I probably wouldn't have thought about or in that sequence, happening sort of back to back. You go back and look, that's sort of the end of LA Weekly, Village Voice, Tokyon, Vice, Stop Smiling, whatever. All the magazines that sort of existed from the late 90s through the early part of the aughts that were outside of the mainstream, I guess you could call it. And then everyone just sort of innovated. I sort of doubled down into print and moved into books in part because I was depressed about. I spent a couple years, Randy, just working in the cloud. In other words, whatever I was producing with my friends was only published online. Yeah. And there was something extremely depressing about that. Not even because I was actually making more money because you didn't have to make a product. So therefore everyone got paid better. But there was something uber depressing about not actually making a physical object and having how many months or years of whatever you were doing actually come out in some sort of physical form. And I guess, you would maybe have the similar thoughts as a musician, like if, you were putting out records with a label that didn't want to do a physical release. Thankfully, that's not an issue with you guys, but I was curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, but the question, it really is what is a physical release? Like, you know what I mean? You make, it's almost the keychain you get at the end of the ride or something. Like, you really, it's the experience. Like, do records need to exist? I don't know. I had Dean Spunt from No Age on here and from Post Present Medium Records, he has his own record label. And we talked about, like, what does it all mean? And his his double down was like, well, that's the whole point of it, is to make something physical. It's the whole idea. But but obviously you can't ignore the streaming's there, and that's where most people are going to interact with music. However, that being said, the record is the reason. It's the reason for the season. It's the reason to do the whole thing. Much like a book publisher. You know what I mean? Like, how does it work in publishing? I mean, I guess there's audiobooks, and then there's like iPad versions of things. Where do you interact in that digital world, if at all?
That's a great question. You know what's funny? And I probably never even talked about this, so you're a very astute interviewer, Randy. No one has ever asked us. We've made 75 books in the last 8 years. No one has ever asked us to make an ebook once. A digital book. No one even said, it's in the contract. But no one has said, hey, is it time to make the ebook?
The distributor.
Well, I mean, to be honest,
who would want
I know that's a good point. I'd say until COVID, when we launched Hat and Beard Editions, which is the literary imprint, where we now do a couple books of essays and a few books of poems a year. The rights were not available to us digitally, because we would do something in a way that would preclude us from being able to do something in which could be produced digitally, which in the minds of rights holders and their lawyers is always looked at as something that can be pirated easily. Mm-hmm. And, in the case of, let's say, a PDF, which would be an ebook version of a art book, it would be pretty easy to pirate it, even if it had a water seal on it or a watermark. Hold on, let me grab one thing just to show you a visual cue of something I'm talking about. So I just got these in bulk last night. This is our book with the band Pulp. Yeah. I'm with Pulp. Wow, are you? If we made 3,000 copies of this. If we had to get the rights to all this stuff from Universal Music that owns Island Records to do, digital releases and all this other stuff, it would probably be a rights nightmare, and we wouldn't even be able to. It would force us out of being able to even produce it, because the rights would be so cost prohibitive that we wouldn't even be able to get the rights to do this.
And the kind of stuff we're talking about is like archival material, photographs, lyrics, all these things that are included in there. I mean, that's the bulk. I would imagine, like the IP sort of stuff between like the rights holders, even the record label owns the right to the photo. Then now you have a photographer. If it gets into that kind of stuff, is that the meat of it, or? Yeah,
no, that's the meat of it. And I think it's sort of, it goes one step beyond that, in that if you want to do something right, you definitely want to contact everybody that's still alive, or reach out to, through due diligence, the next of kin that's running the estate of a famous photographer or something, and you make sure everybody's credited properly. I would say a book like this falls into a gray area, in that it's the band's archive personally. Mark Webber, who's been in the band since 1994, 95, 94. So whatever, 30 years. And obviously they broke up originally in 2002, had a reunion tour in 2011, 2010, and then have this most recent one. And it looks like they're writing some new material. So it remains to be seen. But we use the fair use clause, which was that, yes, we have, all the Island record covers for a different class, and this is hardcore and stuff that came out via the record label, but it's assorted in a way that's almost like a museum monograph. And we're presenting it historically with all this other stuff. And it's also like, because look, I mean, Island did probably pay for all of it, all of this graphic design,
Sure.
But like the way it's presented, it's almost like a museum monograph. And there's a certain gray area in the law that allows one to publish that stuff, because at a certain point it becomes history, and it's sometimes 25, 40, 50 years later, but then you have a slightly different argument as to, why we're presenting this and why it's in this format and why you need to give us the rights to run all the album covers. Because without the album covers, we'd be losing a lot of context.
Mm-hmm. But
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if somebody takes a photo, of like it's V-Day, when there's a photograph and someone's holding up a newspaper. You would pay the photographer who took the photo, not the people in the photo, and certainly not the publication, the New York Times, or the writer, or the graphic designer or typesettist who worked on that piece of newspaper that's in there, even though that is a separate IP that's present in the frame of a photo, because it is at this point a historical photo. It's a historical document of a time and place and a day, and it features the material around it, or there's a background, a billboard in the background of the photo for Coca-Cola. You wouldn't have to go to the modern day Coca-Cola company and say
exactly, because that would be,
because that's just, you took a picture in Times Square in 1945. Like, this is what it's going to be.
Yes, because it's incidental to the photograph and why it's being used. I mean, I think I should, because you're a musician, and there's presumably a lot of music heads and other musicians listening to this. I got to give props to Mark Webber, the guitarist and keyboardist in the band, because my original idea, and we'd been friendly for years, just casually, was to do a book about different class for the 25th reunion of the album, which would have been, I guess, 2020. And then COVID hit, and then we sort of took a different direction. But I remember Mark saying, look, if we do different class, I know for a fact Universal's doing a different class box set, and they're going to include a book with that box set. And it's probably going to be a double album set, and they're going to freak out if they find out there's a competing book, because then their actual box set project that they are producing physically for the super fans could be thwarted by your thing. So that was when he cleverly made the suggestion, hey, let's use my vaster archive and do like the archive of the band, which, by the way, I hope to be a regular series. And, we're talking with a couple other bands now that have from a different era, right? Like they would have started in like the pre-digital age era. So there'd be all this ephemeral material related to the band that frankly nowadays wouldn't exist. It would exist in some digital sphere, but you wouldn't have the flyers, the handbills, the record label merch, the stuff that they'd go around and bandy about with the record stores and give out free stuff. All that stuff is kind of all digitally produced now, as you know, firsthand being a musician and being in a band. And that's what's, I guess maybe one of my sort of hobbies or specialties is like, having been someone who collected that stuff as a kid, now to be able to find these different archives from various bands I like and be able to make some sort of book showcasing, the story visually with someone in the band themselves who happen to keep a good records of all this. And much kudos to Mark Webber too for carting. I mean, he's lived in the same place in Camden Town, I guess now for 25 years, but he's had this archive since 86 when he was the fan club president.
Wow.
Before he joined the band, because he's much younger than Jarvis and some of the other original members. Not that much younger, but like almost, I don't know, 5-7 years younger. Yeah. And so he'd been carting this shit around since 86, since moving to London, since, however many apartments, it obviously grew as the band grew, but, kudos to him for keeping all this stuff, because most of the bands just don't have this stuff, not this degree of stuff.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, I can hear all of the former band members, eyes lighting up as they hear this, and all of the wives just beginning to cry, like, no, he's gonna get all this stuff out of the garage. It validates all of those plastic totes, those big bins that band members keep for years and years, and and the wives like, can we throw this out? Do you really need this this clipping of your first show listing in the LA Weekly? It's like, see, we're going to do a book of it one day. I mean, I've had, I have many of these similar totes that tell stories, of all those early days and all those things. And my wife always looks at them like, what are you doing? I'm like, there's going to be a museum one day. What are you talking about? Every band, doesn't every band think there's at least one guy in every band? There's one guy who doesn't even know what day it is, where they're at, what show, what city they're in. And then the other guy that knows everything and is keeping all the wristbands from every backstage show and every pass and every festival.
Well, and I should say as a thank you to you, at Aaron Rose's recent sale, one of my prized possessions was going home with one of the Kinkos made, or wherever, like Kinkos, early no age stickers, that was sort of like
early stickers,
just as a sort of piece of early propaganda, for the band, and
oh my god,
and you probably remember early on, one of the first books that Hat and Beard did was, Brian Rodinger, our mutual friend, and I were working on this Slash book forever. He made a limited that he had bought all the flyers, as many as he could, from every show that happened between 1977 and 1980 at various clubs, various places all over the area. And the limited was like a box set where we reproduced that stuff, almost just to show how, definitive Brian was in his collecting of this particular era of music in LA history. But also just the sort of artwork and the sort of immediacy of how amazing that was, which seems almost quaint now because we just have all these devices on our phone that can produce all this amazing shit. And not to speak of the AI that's coming.
Right.
but that this was sort of a cut and paste era where you had to like, the band had to actually sit around and think about like, well, what are we going to put on the flyer and what are we going to do? How are we going to get people out to the Smell or wherever?
Yeah.
And you had to do this sort of grassroots shit. And now it all happens digitally, but back then it was like dropping flyers at record stores and bookshops, giving them out to friends when you're bopping around town for a couple of weeks, having them be put up in the windows of various places that your friends own, cafes, restaurants, bars, etc. That still happens, and you walk around Echo Park or wherever, and you can see that. But I don't think it has the same gravity and the same effectiveness as it did in a pre-digital age.
Yeah, well, I mean, it just speaks to the human experience, the daily life. Like, what good is a flyer up in a cafe if you work from home and you're making coffee at home? You know what I mean? And you know who goes to the cafe? These are all the questions that all the out of work screenwriters are going to see. You have a punk show going on. Is that their cup of tea? If it is, maybe they'll go. Maybe, you know what I mean? That'd be the best part of it. Like the band, really catering music catered towards the clientele of each of these places. Like suddenly we have all these writers with laptops at our punk shows. I don't know what happened here. It's like we noticed the audience changed as the cafe audience changed. But I want to talk about a little bit about that. That cliched idea of the digital revolution or the digital sort of turning from the weeklies, like you said, dovetailing into the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, I think a lot of it, obviously, the device was the thing. I mean, all of this stuff, websites existed before, but there was something about the platforming of the pocket, sort of window into the digital world that sort of granted that, Watt always has a great thing, if you call a cell phone or if you text you, it's from the leash, one of the many Wattisms I love in life, but he's calling you from the leash, that's his version of the cell phone. But it's eventually, we have these little pocket dimensions, portals in our pockets, and that sort of really has something to do with it as well. I mean, what was your experience like? Or how do you see that from someone on the inside, from magazine to website or to mobile device? Like magazine to mobile device was really where the change happened, right?
Yeah, I was maybe a intentional Luddite in that I sort of never used MySpace, Friendster, or Facebook ever. Like when Instagram came out, I sort of did take the plunge, I suppose, but I was sort of always vociferously against that stuff. And we were late in the game for sure with Stop Smiling. I remember someone had the URL, so we had to have stopsmilingonline.com as that URL because we're not on top of it, in part because the idea itself was to create a print magazine. And it's not that I didn't use email or have a fondness for the web and how great it was to spread the word, but I think, we were almost, Stop Smiling anyways, was a throwback magazine in the sense that we were emulating in the 90s, early aughts, what we had missed growing up from a different era, which was this era of new journalism and people writing these long form nonfiction pieces and doing interviews and oral histories like Studs Terkel that really let the artists or whoever's being written about talk. And that was happening simultaneously to the blurb culture, the listicle culture that dovetails with what you're talking about, that transition into the digital
and Twitter,
age.
160 characters. I mean, there's not a conversation. An exchange of ideas doesn't happen at 160 characters at a time. And even when they doubled it, it was still too late to really have a discussion. It wasn't a back and forth. It was arguments. It was positioning and yelling and, short phrases.
What this stuff is proven, the post digital age or whatever we're living in now, I think is in a way like my current business, Hat and Beard, is almost like a public service in that we're making stuff that probably wouldn't otherwise exist because it wouldn't make it past the focus group mentality of the big publishers. But also it has to exist as a physical thing to be real. And then once it does, then, the cat's out of the bag. I kind of revel in being able to still be able to do that stuff, even in an age, like you said, where most people are consuming music digitally. Most people are probably streaming and not going to as many movie theaters. And books were always sort of, and in magazines, I guess print media, we could call it more generally, were always sort of the last medium to have the massive amount of disruption. I mean, you could almost argue that until Penguin and Random House merged like 10 years ago, which was unthinkable for most of the 20th century, because they were stark competitors. That was sort of what had already happened in the music industry 10, 15 years earlier, where the record labels, the big ones anyways, there were 6 or 7, then it was 5, then it was 4. They kind of merged their way into irrelevance. And the indie labels that survived were able to then scoop up the best stuff and continue on with some balance of old and new together. I think, one of the things that we've done almost as a testament to ourselves, but also, our ability to sell stuff to people, but also to show that there is this 1,000 true fan model, is we always have sold half of whatever we're printing directly to the fans. And the other half goes through some modicum of what the old system was, funneling into retail, funneling into things like Amazon.
But direct to consumer, that model, sort of working as
a numero group in Light in the Attic who are kindred spirits and do more reissue stuff with music, but have a similar sense of like doing things that are, a lot of it is historical and looking back on things. A lot of our books are sort of doing a similar thing. It sort of sucks, but you have to sort of lean in on the pre-sales and the people who are going to come out early, because the way the margins work, and I remember calling a lot of the record labels when we started just to get a sense of, well, what are the margins for the indie labels versus the indie publishers? And of course, the publishers' terms were a bit worse because they have something like Amazon that has really disrupted the industry now for 30 years.
I guess, a lot of people forget Amazon was a bookstore. That was sort of the
Amazon
early days of like, hey, we're just a bookstore over here. Like, and then wait, you can buy milk from your bookstore? Like, sure, we could buy flip flops. Yeah, you could buy anything. Yeah.
Well, there's an amazing book by Jason Epstein, who's no longer with us, but he started he was part of the paperback revolution in the 1950s, the so-called quality paperback revolution. And he started Anchor Books, hired Edward Gorey to do all those amazing covers in the 1950s. And then he went on to found the New York Review of Books with his then wife, Barbara Epstein. And these are New York Jewish intellectual types. But in his book, The Business of Books, one of the last chapters is about Bezos reaching out to him early on because he was this kind of publishing veteran of New York of a certain era. And there's something really telling in this sort of written chapter, because it's like what Bezos says to him is that he chose books because it was the easiest thing to basically ruin the marketplace in, because it had been such a gentleman's game of trying to do things fairly with like regards to like selling literature versus product and widgets, that he saw the biggest weakness, and therefore that's why he chose books. It really wasn't sort of an intent to be a bookstore. And of course it became the everything store, as you noted. What's weird is I've almost had to just embrace Amazon at this point. I think initially, we were working with some of these distributors and they were so clearly in bed with Amazon because it was 80% of their sales that we eventually had to leave. And, we're in the midst of doing that right now, again, having kind of flirted with going back to the old system. And what we've sort of realized is if you can't control the price of your own product, you can't make any money. And that's what the hurt of something like Amazon, because what happens is the wholesaler, which in the US case, by the way, there's only one company left doing it, and they're 2 hours outside Nashville. And I'm just going to say they're not of our political persuasion. And they just turned a blind eye because they still get their middleman fee no matter what Amazon charges for it. So you have that going on like in real time with no competition in a complete monopoly setting. And we call it the duopoly of loss. We're just going to get rid of that and sell to the 500 indie stores that matter. And it's sad to say this, but there's more independent bookstores in London and Paris than there are in the United States as a whole now.
But so tell me about this. So the idea of, say it costs, $10 to manufacture the book, rights to the advance to the publisher, everything, whatever it is. Say the boils down to you have $10 spent making each book and you want to sell it for $20. And you're saying that the Amazon price is saying, well, no, we're going to sell it for $11. And the middle guy is going to take 8 of those, and then so now you go into a loss. Is something like that?
Yeah, I mean absolutely. It's a death spiral of loss. And if you can get Amazon reached out to us and said, what if you could set the price of your books? Because I think they see that we're crushing on our Shopify account, and they have a web services business that is part of their, that's how they make money. Amazon is they have a web services business. And so they must have a partnership with Shopify, which is one of the big e-commerce platforms.
Sure.
And, I said, well, if we could sell it on Amazon and set the price so that you'd actually be competing with the indie stores instead of selling it for 38% off. Because once you get a millennial or a Gen Z person, and I would say Gen X is sort of the holding line of people who remember nostalgically analog and are sort of willing to go out of their way to like not use Amazon if it's the cheapest price, just ethically, right? You've lost that whole contingent of people because they're just going to buy it for whoever has the least amount of money. And I almost sympathize with them because they don't have the disposable cash, say we did in the 90s or something like that.
But it's something that you'd go to like stories.com, or I don't know if they sell stuff on there, or Book Soup. And you Book Soup, they have your book for $35, and you go to Amazon, they have it for $18. It's something like that. And then like you're saying, most people below 50 are just going to go, well, I'll buy it for $18, not knowing what obviously they're getting a good deal. That's as far as that commercial transaction goes. Like, I got a good deal, not knowing that you would never sell it for that price, but you have to go take a loss in order to even exist. Something in that nature.
Yes. I mean, in fact, I think you nailed the initial problem, which is what Amazon was doing. So let's just back up and call it price fixing, right? So if you come into a marketplace and you don't have to sell the product to make any money, you can drop it to whatever price you want to capture all the sales. That would be considered price fixing in most normal people's mindsets. That's what Amazon did early on, and then found other products they could identify that could be what you call loss leaders. And then they would make money on lawnmowers and, other shit, right? And they've been very clever about doing that. I'd say, to dig deeper to what you just said, the real rub of this is that when Amazon disrupted the market, the distributors started to freak out because they were basically built to sell to a brick and mortar store. The big box stores of Borders, Virgin Megastore, Tower, which are all extinct now except Barnes & Noble, they had kind of come into the market in the 80s and 90s and changed things dramatically. And I worked at Tower and Barnes & Noble when I was a teenager and into my early 20s, and that's how I learned a lot of how publishing worked, from actually working on the inside of a big box store, not an indie store. And then that gave me an insight into how to help these indie stores. I think where things have gone really awry is something like Art Book DAP. They only pay 20% of the sale, and the cost of the book is more than 20%. So not only does, say, the pulp book, which costs $50, if we put it through Ingram via DAP, Amazon would probably sell it for $26.99, and it's supposed to cost $50, right? And then the stores have to sell it at full price, but with the stores now demanding a 50% discount, free shipping, 120 days to pay, and they can return stuff. Is that even a business? And it's not. And I think what's been most depressing is people will come up to me like, hey, I bought your book at Skylight. I'm like, well, actually, if they bought those books from Ingram, we lost money either way. That's why we're moving to a book club model where we're going to just come out and say, if you really want to support us, join the clubs, and, we're going to still put some stuff out in stores, but we have to change how we're doing this because, the model has become, and it's probably not that dissimilar for vinyl, robbing Peter to pay Paul. In other words, we have to sell 750 of something direct to then lose money selling the other 750 the old way. And somehow absorb all those losses. But know, Randy, that no matter who you're with, if you started after 2010, you do not have any way to make money on your product. It is profitless terms. It is pay to play distribution, not wholesale, where you could actually make the numbers work. Now, I suppose if you made extremely cheap paperbacks that were $2 each, and you didn't care about any of the sort of quality control of what we're making as an object, then perhaps you could maybe eke out 50 cents or $1, here or there. But it's intentionally profitless distribution, which means you only can survive by having wealthy parents to absorb the losses, or be owned by a multinational corporation that can also absorb the losses. There's very little by way of what's independent. And what is there has all gone nonprofit in the last 25 years, probably most notably McSweeney's, Grey Wolf Press, Coffee House Press. I mean, everything that's doing cool stuff, edgier stuff in any genre of book is more or less probably being run now as a nonprofit, mainly so that everyone can write off their time for what they're not paid to be doing, which is a passion business, and then also you make the business more about being sustainable and growing versus making tons of profits for investors, say, where people are cashing out dividends every year. There's just not enough money to be made in any physical product now that's something that you could go to investors and say, hey, if you give us this money, we can triple our money in 3 years or something. That's never going to happen in the sort of post-digital age, because the cost of making all this stuff, I would say, just generally speaking, everything that we used to make before COVID now is 25 to 30% more, from the shipping, the paper,
the supply chain.
Yeah, the supply chain.
Yeah, sure.
And then of course we have the ethical thing where we don't print in China. I remember Brian went over there on some trip. There was a cultural exchange between Los Angeles and Beijing one year, and he had done a bunch of artist books, and he went there for the conference or whatever was happening, but took a couple of days off to just go to see some of these printers. And then you get there and they take your iPhone, because it is a totalitarian police state, and they don't want you filming what's going on in the factories because it's pretty bleak. And so we made a sort of pact with ourselves not to print anywhere that is sort of a model built on unfair wages. And that goes back to, probably the Discord touch and go, whatever 80s indie label ethos of trying to find some sort of more artist friendly way forward. I mean, similarly with our royalty model, the big publishers pay like 6 to 8% royalty, 10 or 15 if you got a good agent. And we do 30% because half the stuff is sold on Instagram and at events. So we don't have to lean in on this kind of old system where, most of the money is actually being made by the wholesaler and the retailer, and nothing is left for the publisher and the artist or author. I mean, at a certain point, it just becomes a joke. You're basically putting something out there that everybody makes money on it except for the people who created it. And that becomes sort of soul crushing to a degree. I mean, I'm sort of an optimist. Obviously, I would have thrown in the towel by now. But what's encouraging is this idea, to sort of turn it into a positive. What we're talking about is that this idea that the younger generation don't care about things like records or books is just absolute hogwash. Now, is it going to be the same as it was in the 90s when this was the mainstream medium of choice and there wasn't things like Spotify? Of course not. It's gone way more niche. But in a way, I welcome that, because I've always kind of worked in the 1,000 True Fans model and built it out from there. Stop Smiling was sort of built like that, and also we've wallowed in what you might call, niche stuff. I mean, Pulp's a pretty big band, but but really more in England than here. I was actually shocked. They're 10 times bigger now in the United States than they were in the 90s when I saw them. And certain bands have that weird staying power. It's interesting to see which ones sort of meet it out. But this idea that like Gen Z and Gen X and large swaths of the millennials don't want anything because they have, they feng shuied their apartment and they don't want to have stacks of stuff is just bullshit. You go to these book fairs, it's almost all 20, 30 something people buying the stuff, Mm-hmm. It's just a different way of maybe them finding out about it. I find that like the young kids find out at the social events, the older people just get out their credit card and buy it online when they see it, and there's like those two silos. And I guess we're about to open a bookstore gallery next year. So we're going to have our own space, and then we'll start to program enough stuff where we'll complete the circle of the ecosystem. We'll be selling our books, but also other people's books, having live music, having these author talks, putting up art shows, selling more than just our own books was always sort of part of the plan. Because frankly, you just can't pay a staff a living wage and live in a city like Los Angeles if you only do one thing. You kind of almost have to have your own ecosystem now if you start something that's an independent publishing house or, a record label. It's not as straight-laced as it was when there were less mediums. And you mentioned the social media earlier. Yeah. Like you need to have – we've been pretty bad about that. We do good with Instagram. Daria, from Zebulon does that for us. She's exceptionally good. I feed her a script of things that are coming up and she improvises. But like – I wish I was better at all that. I think I'm going to have to be as we like promote this book club thing, because I probably will even have to make some short videos and post them of me talking, explaining this, why you have to do this, and not be the Wizard of Oz where I just kind of hide behind the medium and say, oh, it's all in the printed work. Just look at that. That's the work. You have to be more clever than that. I admire my friends and colleagues who are elder statesmen and women who have been able to sort of stay off of all this stuff and be able to still do their business, without giving any examples. I'm sure you can think of a few just amongst our mutual friend groups that have been able to sort of be professionally hired for things and do their thing without having to really, play the game. I mean, what scared me about being a journalist sort of in my last period where I was after Stop Smiling, I like freelanced for everyone for like 2 or 3 years. But what I realized is that getting the day job at one of these newspapers or magazines was the kiss of death, because they expected you to send 3 tweets out a day, to send X amount of emails out a day, to be on Facebook all day. And I was like, well, what about actually writing and reporting the stories? And they divided, and this is how we end up with people like Trump. Like, the media then got so fragmented that, you know, you probably even see it now. You'll be reading some professional site and it'll be loaded with errors. And you're like, how did this shit get up on, like, you know, Vanity Fair or something like that? And it's just because they've cut so many corners, because they've got everybody having to do all these different mediums, that some people just need to hang back and edit the work and publish it. You know, some people have to sit in the studio with the band and not be promoting themselves half the day on social media, and just record the songs and mix the album with the band. That element, I think, is not going away for all of us. You're a musician, I'm a publisher and writer and editor, but like, we do have to sort of keep up with the Joneses, I guess, because this is how you reach people now. Like, we're going to start using Substack and TikTok soon, stuff I would never have even thought that would be even effective for us. But, you know, I've been convinced otherwise, that this, yes, actually, you could take what we're already doing and just start spewing this stuff out using these other mediums. You may not like the medium, but it will be good for selling books and also for getting the word out about the types of books that we publish.
Can you hire a choreographer to create dances around each release? You know, each book has its own dance that can be populated through TikTok.
I mean, at this point, leaning into that meta stuff wouldn't be a bad idea. If we got serious money and we could use these mediums and actually pay people to create the content for the marketing on these mediums, I would absolutely do that. One thing I am thinking about doing, because I just noticed it wasn't that expensive, is, you've probably seen this too. You're driving around in LA and you like see 8 billboards for Geneva Jacuzzi's new album, and you're like, how the fuck does this indie label have enough money to do all this advertising? And the fact is it's not that much in certain parts of LA for these smaller billboards. And I think what I'm going to try to do with the book clubs is next year, like, buy out a billboard every other month and have a different graphic designer create something for the book club model. And, you know, It'll have some URL, but we'll have some sort of visual tie-in. You know, Brian will do one, you know, we'll bring in like 10 different people. But a lot of this stuff costs money. And I think people are under this assumption that, so sort of Instagram must be great for you. I hear people say that all the time. Like, Instagram must sell tons of books. It does. You know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in books and sales probably go through Instagram a year. I haven't looked like recently, but I know there's a huge referral. And certainly after we hit 10,000 followers, then you get the buy tools, which, you know, they want you to spend a lot of time on the platform, Randy. So you have to use it a lot before you get those buy tools, which allow you to just, you don't have to go to the link in the bio. You just like push a button and it goes right to a store. Yeah. You know, but to really make money using Facebook Ad Manager, which, you know, of course, controls Facebook and owns it, it's actually like, we have people that are paid to do that. It's not like as effective as it was apparently before some update a few years ago on the iTunes store or the Apple App Store, where I guess it was more measurable and more voyeuristic and more what we would call surveillance capitalism was more effective before a recent update. I think it was 2018, 2019. I don't work in digital marketing, but I'm spending a lot of money to basically make back that money in sales, but it's a wash. There's not like, you're not spending 500 micro dollars and getting 5,000 in sales. It's pretty meted out. These people have been able to turn these things into an advertising model.
They have a throttle. They have a spigot. You know what I mean? Basically on it. Like, oh, cool. Like, I saw you got all this attention, so we're going to go ahead and put a dial on that, and we're going to dial it back until you choke you out, until you pay us to get your followers to look at you again. And now we're going to suppress your placement. You know what I mean? It's a very boot on neck kind of feeling of like, oh, this is working great for us. Like, you have so many followers. It's like, yeah, but unless I pay for those followers to see me, then they'll actually be suppressed. You know what I mean? It's like, you did it organically. Great. Now you have to pay to have the thing you built, and whatever you built doesn't really belong to you either. Your followers aren't really yours. Yes. You know what I mean? You're both doing free work. You and your followers are expected to do free work for a platform that you have no stake in. So,
and I think everybody loses sight of that while using it every day. And I think that's what always bothered me about the other platforms. And I was maybe this grumpy old man, even in my 20s, saying, you know, I don't want to do this because we don't own it and we don't control it. And what happens when this becomes the next thing? And that is something that is an apt defense of this stuff. Like, you can see it even with the prioritization of Facebook having pushed Reels for the last year or two on Instagram heavily in order to compete with TikTok has fucked up the algorithm to the degree that we don't get as much people seeing our stuff anymore because they're pulling levers behind the scenes, as you noted, where, yes, if you want access back to what you were getting, now it's time to pay. You know, I remember talking to the guys who started one of them was a big data guy who started Vinyl Me Please, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is basically like, you know, for listeners who don't already know, is like basically the record of the month club for the post-digital age. And you sign up per genre and you get a different record. But I remember one of the guys telling me like the first 2,500 subscribers were like the super fan people who love music and records. And then everything else after that was metadata. And they were sort of growing it based on how you could study people who liked Lou Reed on Facebook and then have ads pop up for, you know, the Transformer album that they had redone for it. And for like a good decade, that was a measurable advertising medium. And then I guess, you know, and I alluded to this earlier, and if I have the timeline somewhat wrong, it's because I don't work in this field full time, but all the people who work for us that do the digital marketing said that at some point the App Store said enough. And this was a privacy thing that Apple did unilaterally. And that cut off Facebook's ability through Instagram to spy on people the way that they were doing it before. You know, and this is around the time of DuckDuckGo launching as an alternative to Google, which is also spying on you, you know, with every search. And if you use Gmail, they're pouring through your mail to market you shoes or whatever, you know. I think we all know this stuff's going on. I just think we've all kind of forgotten how Orwellian it is and how Big Brother seems almost quaint, because we wouldn't need like rats and like Room 101 to be forced into subjection. We'll click I accept some crazy legal framework that's released to us before we start using the medium without reading any of it. And this alludes to your point, which is these followers aren't yours. These images posting that are yours are not yours, technically. And, you know, if your band pisses us off, you know, and I've seen this happen with a couple of our artists where whatever they're putting up just somehow rankles someone in the sphere of Facebook and suddenly their account's gone. You know, they have 27,000 followers and suddenly it's gone and they have to start over entirely. They put up a picture of a gang once and that was like inciting violence. So, you know, and there's no one to call. So you're like, wow, I've built, you know, 30,000 followers on this platform over 5 years. And now I have to start over. And I mean, luckily in the case of Merrick Morton, we found out that it was someone that was reporting him to Facebook who was basically jealous of this work that he created of shooting gangs in the early 80s and 90s. And it was some nefarious person, but still like the outcome was the same. He lost his handle. I think he had 70,000 followers. You know, his book was about to come out. We were like, holy shit. We went to the media and NPR did a story about it. And I can send it to you. That's, you know, but that's the only reason that the account got reinstated because someone at Facebook, you know, like heard it and was like, oh shit, you know, and then suddenly he heard from Facebook and they're like, oh, we're sorry. You know, we're going to put your account back up right now. You know, meanwhile, he'd been, you know, trying to contact them and showing them screen grabs of all this stuff, how he'd, you know, been kind of like character assassinated by some guy who was reporting him. He wasn't doing the things he was alleged to have been doing. I mean, yes, he was posting pictures of cholos in fucking East LA, but he wasn't glorifying gang culture or like putting up symbols himself or saying, you know, endorsing violence or anything, which was what Facebook's excuse for taking his his Instagram account down was. But having sort of lived in the sort of swamp of that for the month or two, and then seeing like the victory of getting a piece. But all I kept thinking was most people don't know people at NPR like Rick and I do, who once we told them about this, were like, holy shit, we're going to do a 6-minute story on this. You know, the only reason it happened is because the media exposed it. And then they were like, oh shit, we better do something. But 99% of the people who have that happen to them, if they're in a band, if they're an artist, whatever, they're probably just fucked and they have to redo it all, you know? Yeah. And that's sort of the lesson of that. I mean, I've always sort of told everybody, like, we can use this stuff and it's helpful, but I think we can't be overly reliant on it. I'm sure it's the same with bands because you don't know when it's going to move to the next medium, whether it's TikTok or Snapchat or whatever the next thing is. Yeah. And also the point you made, which is that it's not really yours. You may be putting up tons of music and videos and all this cool shit, but it's just the way they are viewing it, it's just a weird portal. And, that stuff technically is yours. It's on your phone. You can publish it elsewhere. But as it exists in this place where people are accessing it, they can snap their fingers and take down the Randy Randall, handle immediately. No, not that they would. Why would they have any reason to mess with you? Or no age. But it's weird. But it's weird to have a whole whole business built around that, though.
One of the best things we had early on in this whole world was we instead of hiring a manager, we hired an assistant and realized it was a better investment, business wise. And the assistant ran our Facebook through her profile. It was part of the, whatever those early days, you didn't even have profile. It was whatever, as a name. And then at some point she wanted to leave Facebook. She deleted her profile, and therefore there was nobody managing the no age page. And so there was no way to get back in it. There was no, it was, a page was different than profile. Originally we signed up it was under first name, no, last name, age was the personal profile we made for the band. And then once the assistant deleted her profile, we were just like, I think we had 30,000 fans on Facebook and no way to access it. And so we weren't necessarily censored, but there was a funny sort of moment of like, oh, how does this thing work? And then you realize that's all that, there is no marketing budget. It is that is your marketing. There's no other way of looking at, advertising. It's all through that. But I want to ask you, what were some of the first books or publications or things that first inspired you, to go down this rabbit hole? Why take this Herculean task of being a publisher in the 2020s onto your shoulders? What is it? Is there a golden mountain or a peak in the sky that you hope to emulate or reflect back the light that you received as a young person?
That's a great question. I think, my parents they had their records from college and they didn't really have any books. And, my wife and I talk about this a lot. Is my obsession with books and music kind of built out of this almost want and need for having met friends whose parents were really cool and actually got them into stuff and then having to discover it myself. I think, I can't deny that I'm sort of an accidental publisher. I was working at record labels, and if Napster hadn't have happened in the late 90s, when I was in my early 20s, we're similar in age. I probably, my goal was to work at record labels and sign bands and be an A&R person. And I always made zines with my friends. I think, there was something really empowering about the sort of desktop publishing age that came about in the 90s when we were kids, where you could suddenly have these programs and actually make something yourself and make it look pretty pro by the early to mid 90s with things like Quark Express and what eventually became Adobe InDesign. The desktop publishing bug, I used to book shows, and so I'd have to make the flyer. So there was always some sort of art or a physical thing that I had to do that involved graphic design and art direction a little bit. And so I think I caught the bug pretty early with that. I really was a magazine person. I mean, I always felt like magazines, like bookstores, are their own condensed version of some world created by the editors of that magazine or that bookstore. I wish magazines could still exist. I think I liked the immediacy of what we were doing, where we had to put something to print every 2 months for decades. The books take longer. I think they've been more suitable towards my lifestyle, having become a parent in the last decade, because, some of the books take years to come out. It is a little anticlimactic. As far as taking the plunge as a business person, I remember, talking about this with Rodinger, where, we were both we have this skill, both of us, in different arenas, him more in the graphic design art direction, me more in the packaging art direction, editorial, but it's kind of a useless skill in the post-digital age, making all this stuff. And so I do help a lot of other people make stuff and not get screwed. Because if you get into this, it's like making records and you don't know what you're doing. You could really screw up and lose a lot of money. So I think leaning into that. And then, like I said earlier in our chat, there was a couple kind of what I call the wilderness years after Stop Smiling, before Hat and Beard, which was about a 6-year period where I worked at, I started the Pitchfork print magazine with those guys. I worked at Playboy. I worked at Toshin. I worked at Fiden. I worked at Chronicle, as a freelancer. And I just realized one day, wow, me and my friends were actually really good at making stuff. This other stuff there's tons of money and there's a big company. It actually moves at even a more glacial pace. And, the joke when I was working at the bigger art publishers is that you could get a feature film made faster than getting one of these books out. And I saw an opening, and I think also just the frustration of pitching all this stuff when I was like doing books for the bigger publishers, and they would just always use some sort of market research to like poo-poo the idea down or dumb it down in a way that wasn't what we intended it to be. And I mean, initially it was just sort of like a side hustle, like let's take 5 things that were shot down and just put them out ourselves and see what happens. But that was such a domino effect, almost proving our point, that then it just sort of spiraled from there. I think the trick has been surviving COVID, which thankfully, knock on wood, it's almost been 5 years, but it only worked because we started a nonprofit. I won't get into too much of the weeds of that, but we started a nonprofit, and had we not done that and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, there's no way that we probably would still be in business. Now, things have kind of resettled post-COVID, and we are leaning in more on the LLC. I love the nonprofit world. I mean, it definitely is more of a mission-driven thing where whatever you're doing, whether it's having an exhibition for an artist or promoting a certain band, there is more of like an artistic goal than a financial goal, because the goal isn't to necessarily make tons of profits. But I think it's like the museum world where you're basically stuck in the rut of having to ask very wealthy people for favors. And if they're not in a giving mood that week or that month, you don't get the check. And therefore, you don't grow the organization, or you don't get that project underwritten. And that can be really soul crushing in a way, because you're almost like have a business that's decided on the whims of what wealthy people want to do and how big of an art patronish soul they have. And to me, I think all of us could be using our time better spent just making the books and selling them than meeting with, the so-called cultural elite people. Like, I feel sorry for the people on the museum level where their job is just to like, kiss the ring all day and hope to get the check. Because there's just a lot of no's and a lot of maybes and a lot of stuff in limbo. And nothing depresses me more really than starting something and then having to shelve it and have it never come out. It's fine if it takes 7 years, as long as it actually comes out eventually. But when someone spends 100 or 200 hours on something, and me and 5 other people, it's just so depressing to see that, it got half the funding, but because we didn't get this one grant, we can't do it now. So, I've found a delicate balance where we've been able to make, I guess what you'd call more of like the artist monographs and these smaller run things. They're 500 or 1,000 copies. We would, call them record store day merch, if you were going to use the music analogy. That stuff kind of all runs through the nonprofit. It doesn't have to make a ton of money. The No Age book was like that. We got like a grant, and like, I can't remember how we patched it together, but, it was something where it was like, we just made a small amount for the fans. And I think that's can be done as a viable business on the side. Meanwhile, the bigger books like Pulp and Velvet Underground and Lou Reed and things like that, where you're kind of tapping into an already existing cult audience, that stuff has the chance to be what you'd call evergreen, which is, that stuff stays in print. People start listening to the Velvet's album. They search out what books exist. This is one of them. It's one of the only so-called art books about the band. So then they buy that book 10 years from now after it came out, and it still has the same relevancy. I think trying to pick those projects is really hard. What is this thing that is this limited edition book that's like an object versus something that you almost do keep in print, second, third printing, fourth printing. And they're two different animals. I think we've been very lucky in that we can do a little bit of both. We do about 15, 20 things a year, and I'd say it's split down the middle, where half of them, the nonprofit stuff, let's call it art projects. And then the other stuff, we do have a profit loss. We do have to probably double the money that we're spending on it. And it is a much more riskier endeavor. But, I think together, that's what was happening at most of the record labels and publishers throughout the 20th century. There were a handful of things paying for the whole roster. It was a little bit more crapshoot then, Randy, and you lived through this too, where, the 90s was, we've got 3 bands that sell, let's throw 30 more bands against the wall and see what happens, And it didn't work out for some bands. I just read the 33 and the third book about Jawbreaker's 24-hour revenge therapy, and it depressed the shit out of me thinking about, that this band, because they signed, their record on the major label came out maybe 5 years to the day that Nevermind broke. The sellout, thing, which would not even be an issue now, was so great that like the band was so disgusted by the reaction to their major label record, which finally had like a pretty polished production value. The songs were just as great. Maybe it didn't sound as like, punk rock or whatever as the previous ones. But it was crazy to think about that world then, and how now, no one would even sort of quibble about, whatever that sort of selling out mentality was. And I think some of it ties into what we've been talking about the last hour, which is, I guess, the post-digital age more generally, and how, what is the artist's place in it? I mean, there's one book I should recommend, which I tried desperately to make into a documentary, but a lot of wealthy people, frankly, when they read the book, they felt pretty bad about how things work for most people nowadays. And the book is called The Death of the Artist, How Creators Are Surviving in the Age of Big Tech and Billionaires. And each chapter is every industry. So you got the music industry, fashion industry, books. And the music chapter is amazing. You got Kim Deal, you got Albini, you've got, maybe the guys in Pavement. I can't remember who else, but Ian Mackay. Everybody's sort of saying, oh yeah, I mean, it was terrible in the 90s, but like at least you made money and you could buy a house, Now like what the streaming pays, like this is just like, we feel bad for these generations. And each chapter is, you see the precipitous decline of any real money going to the actual creators. And then, you look at the music scene and it's like, what, 10 or 20 top tier artists make all the money on the streaming. And that I think Spotify made a rule recently where if you don't get a certain amount of streams, you don't even get paid anymore. And obviously the pay was quite pitiful to begin with, but it's actually one of the things that gets me up every morning, Randy, which is a depressing thing to admit, is that my industry, book publishing, which has been bludgeoned by Amazon and various other forces of late capitalism, is still not as fucked up as how the movie business and the music business are with regards to my friends who are musicians and filmmakers. In other words, I get out most of the stuff I intend to every year, whereas I watch my friends navigate this very perilous world where, these films take sometimes a decade to make. These albums sometimes jump to 4 labels before they come out. And I feel like I slightly have an easier game to play, even with only having to sell 1,000 or 2 of these books, than what my friends in bands or my filmmaker friends are dealing with, and other creators. I mean, that's not to talk about design or the art world or fashion world, which are also equally cutthroat. Books in a way have always been the same business. Like if you build it, they will come. And I buy more records now than ever. And I know I'm probably not the sort of case study of the average person, but I love that you get the digital download card with the physical release. And I maybe go out of my way as an outlier to do that because I want
you're
it.
Drag City, unless you're Dan.
Is that true? He doesn't include the digital card. I didn't realize.
I mean, not for any of our records. We made it a point, and I think on the first one we did, with Ranger Design, was download not included. We made sure we put a sticker on the front of it, a little circular round sticker down. Digital download not included, just so everyone knew.
Well, I think that in a weird way, like if we did ebooks, we would do the same thing. We would have like you bought the pulp book, you would get a card. One of the things that people told me is that those cards have very minimal success rate. And I remember a lot of music industry people saying, oh, it's only like 15, 20%. But the cost of putting that card in there is so insignificant that it seems like it's still worth it, because you're gaining something from it. I mean, it's probably not enough for like the bosses, like to say, oh man, 10%, this sucks. But I do think that it finds a balance between old and new, where like you have the digital shit if you need it. You probably already have Apple Music or Spotify, so you could probably access most of this stuff anyways. But, as you know, with a lot of, physical releases now, they try to put something extra with the physical release to make it the added value of buying it, as opposed to whatever exists in the digital sphere. And look, I love CDs, and I bought a boombox recently, and I've been listening to lots of CDs because you can go to Amoeba now and spend like $30 and get like 8 amazing records, and then bring those on a road trip and still listen to them in album form. Even though it's just as easy to skip on a CD.
You don't need Wi-Fi to listen to a CD.
And when you road trip and you go camping, you kind of realize that, like, obviously out in the woods, like you need batteries, but like, even if you're staying in a cabin, like I kind of go back to like analog formats. I think the most depressing thing for me with music digitally is how younger generations have fallen into like a early 60s mindset where it's about 1 or 2 songs now instead of listening to the whole album. And I think that has definitely hurt the listening experience. And I won't opine about it any more than that, but I do like notice like the younger people, that work with Hat and Beard that are in their 20s or something, when we're talking about, like I saw the new Pavement film the other night, and like they know like 3 songs, but they don't really even know what albums they're on. Like it's like, oh well, you have to listen
such
to
a great
all
album band. Yeah,
So you have to listen to Slanted and Enchanted to understand why this makes sense and the sequence that they released it in. And like, yeah, that sounds cool, but you should go and listen to the album. And then I sound like some grumpy old man, like, oh, you got to listen to it on vinyl, or you don't.
Yeah. Some bands, I mean, it's about the record experience, because each song may sound slightly different. I mean, Pavement's a great. If you only heard 2 States, and you're like, well, that's that band, versus whatever, Cut Your Hair, or what I mean. There's all these different things. It's like they're different bands from different songs. They're different. They express those different influences. One thing I want, but before we wrap up, we're almost done. But I'm curious to pick your brain a little bit about this. The feeling I had last night, I was talking with my wife about this impending election that has now been resolved, and we're all mourning or celebrating. But I feel, almost like in that brutal honesty or telling on myself, that I am now today more naive or misinformed or blissfully naive, but also more confident in whatever opinions I have, based on so little actual research that's done. I feel like I'm inundated with headlines, with constant, opinions and thoughts and input, these micro flashes of advertisements and information, to where I can feel I speak relatively, confidently. Well, this is what's going on. This is what's going on. And then if I really had to cite my sources, or to refer to the hours spent reading this book or this article or this thing, the actual consuming, the amount of stuff I say in such a confident way versus the actual how little research is actually involved in my day-to-day life. Research meaning just, really digging into the details of the thing and conforming my own opinion, versus just spouting back a headline I saw, recently in the last 24 hours. I feel so confident with that. Well, I read a headline. Yeah, that's that thing. I got the thing right. I said the things. I said the right words in the right order. Okay, I did my job. I'm gonna sit back here and just doom scroll for the rest of the day. I am as guilty as anybody. I have no unique set of skills or lifestyle that allows me to do anything different than anyone else. I got the kids, trying to make money, trying to keep food on the table, keep a roof over our heads, just like anybody. And it just became a scary thought as this feeling of like, I feel confident, yet if I had to be honest, pretty misinformed, or at least not doing my part, where I feel like, and I don't know if that was ever any different, I guess. And I want to opine this time and the closest thing I could say within my own biography, my own life, was college. Like, I would go see people speak. I would go listen to authors talk about the thing, then I would read the book. And there was a luxury of time in this particular early aughts college experience I had at a liberal arts college, that I was like, oh, cool. I'm reading things. I'm forming opinions. I'm going to talk with other people about them. Like, that was great. At least if I was wrong, I could cite my influences and why I was wrong about whatever I had. Or if I was going to go to protest, I had some basis of an article, at least, about something that I could, from a publication like the New York Times, where I could go, well, it was published in the Times. That meant something. I read a physical paper and I know what I was talking about. And that's why I'm going to go take to the streets and say, this is wrong. I believe this, and I'm going with other people. But I just don't know, if I had to go protest something when there are plenty of things to protest now, where and how am I interacting with that? And I guess just from, in your kind of cultural place of, from magazine, print culture, where does this sit with you, like on average? I mean, I feel like I'm a pretty average person, but how does that, and is this an accurate picture of most people in America?
I think so. And I think I'm an obsessive type who was always like reading 4 newspapers and can spout off all this insane international news, and, was sort of studious in that regard, and, maybe was, whatever, mansplaining 20 years ago. And I would never do that now. But I think there's such an information overload. 2 things occurred to me, when you were, sort of framing this issue, which is the first is like a perfect example is today's vote, election day in California. And for those who don't live in California, they have a ballot measure that have a number, and you really have to do your research. And if otherwise you go in and you're like, wait, like, this is about affordable housing, but then this other thing is kind of about affordable housing, but maybe it's a ruse run by billionaires to screw over everybody. With voting in general, I think in a state like California, to touch on your point, you kind of have to like come up with a crib sheet. And I remember my wife and I were hiking earlier today, and we were like, shit, like, I don't know what all the ballot measures are. We're going to actually have to do a little research, but I'd say you're on the right path. I mean, when people tell me they're bored nowadays with the amount of entertainment that exists on these devices in our pockets, or in a physical book, or listening to an album, or whatever you can have, I'm always kind of flummoxed. I think what scares me is that to get the quality time you're talking about, like, this author's speaking and I'm really interested in this subject, and it's about, housing reform or something in all cities, and I'm going to read the book and go to it. And having those sort of pockets of time that are, only available, say, to like college students or people in their early 20s before they get loaded down with, mortgages and families and having to make a shitload more money, is that you almost have to intentionally plan that time that used to be sort of whimsical or serendipitous and is now something like yoga or something where you have to like, oh no, I'm just going to read the newspaper in the bathtub for an hour and turn off my phone and not be distracted and actually read like 10 opinion pieces. Whereas before, that's just what you did. And so the vestiges of not being distracted by doom scrolling are, or the roadblocks in which to unplug from that are more challenging by the day. I think the way that my ADHD brain works, unfortunately, is I have to retreat to those moments of solitude. And one of the reasons I'm maybe so boisterous and talkative is because the other 2/3 of the time I'm sitting in silence, looking at stuff and reading, either reading books, writing about books, or editing books. And it's a very solitary thing, kind of like being a musician. I mean, it's sometimes, you're working with other musicians in a practice space and refining songs, but it's still like somewhat of a solitary thing. I've found that I have to like find pockets of those times. And when I don't have the right balance of what you're talking about, where you feel like there's the proper work-life family balance in our doom scrolling age, then you kind of feel, I start to panic. I start to think that, I'm going to have a burnout soon, that, there's an accelerated part of this culture that I think if you don't find a way to unplug, like going into nature is great for this. It's very easy to just get sucked in a way that it's hard to get out. And I think this explains why half the country seems to be brainwashed, by someone, because my own family members included, my father and sister, they're full MAGA. And it's partially because, there's a comfort in, how this digital stuff can help you connect with others. But there's something very antisocial about what is technically called social media. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if you disagree with these MAGA people so much, it would be very hard to say the things that one says online. And opinions about things, whether it's in the papers or whatever. It's harder to do that to people in person because it humanizes them. And I think the dehumanization of what the internet has done. The other thing, that I thought of instantly was when the Pitchfork magazine started. I hired Simon Reynolds, who had never written for Pitchfork before, to my knowledge, who's one of my favorite music writers. He lives here now, to write a piece about having come up in the early 80s working for Melody Maker, and what it was like when there were like 4 British music weeklies: Sounds, Record Mirror, Enemy, and Melody Maker, which this is making me sound very old. But his argument in that essay, which opened the first print issue of Pitchfork, was that it was actually better when there were these 4 magazines as opposed to the vast everythingness of the internet. Because now you can become an expert on dub music in like 48 hours by just listening to everything that's ever been recorded and reading 20,000 Wikipedia entries. But there's something lost in there, because it's not all accurate what's on the internet. And obviously Wikipedia, even with my own friends, I've seen it be wildly wrong. But there's a sense of immediacy that I've noticed that, at some point the news broke online and it didn't break in daily newspapers anymore. And I think we've been a lot worse off for it as a society since then. Because I remember when I was in college in the 90s, the internet was so new and it was so unverifiable that if you were working as a journalist, you could not trust anything that was online. You had to talk to like 3 sources on the phone, or eventually email became a medium that was acceptable, where they were putting things in writing, mm-hmm. But you couldn't publish anything if it was only online first because it was so unverifiable. It was almost like at the time I didn't see that being this wormhole that would send a good swath of the population of the world down. But it's back to your larger point about our daily lives and being naive about things. I think the naivete in a way is a forced naivete that we almost have to do for ourselves. And to use the Joan Didion phrase, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And if you get too wrapped up in all that stuff, you can see how, that's kind of why I've always hated Twitter, because it seems like you kind of have to be on there all day reading everyone else's shit and being able to lob shit posts against them in order to build up how that stuff's supposed to work and how you have a voice on a platform like that. And to me, it just seemed like, a waste of time in a way, because you almost have to swing and send punches in order to sort of be recognized on the platform. I guess Facebook and Instagram are more innocuous and not as, sort of town square. I mean, that's how they supposedly framed Twitter originally. This is the modern day Times Square in 240 characters or whatever you said earlier. I don't think we're better off for it. I mean, we made this book that I kind of enjoy talking with people at these book fairs about, that my friend Ryan Mungia edited and designed, called Do You Compute, which is named after the Jive Like Jehu song. But it's about selling tech from the atomic age to the Y2K bug. And it's like advertising of technology in general from 1950 to 1999. And you look at this book and everything's utopian. All of the stuff that tech is selling us after the war, all the way until the end of the 90s, with the one flub was the Y2K bug, which, if those who don't remember this, is they thought, when we move to 2000, all the cash registers are going to cause mass chaos and it's going to destroy the economy. And of course, it was a blip on the screen and nothing happened. But then you think about everything that's happened since 2000 on, with the internet, the world, media, how it's been deplatformed and is no longer profitable, and billionaires can own the Washington Post and the LA Times and then not endorse the candidates for president because their business interests come above, the slogan "Democracy dies darkness." Well, I guess it doesn't. We've seen what the outcome of this tech thing is, and the AI obviously factor is also a huge thing with bands and musicians, and obviously with filmmakers. I've had people show me stuff that's been made on AI where I really didn't know it wasn't Nick Cave or something, and I've been kind of fooled in a way. I think that's the scariest part to your larger point, which is, what happens when the deep fakes and the AI get so good that it's very hard to tell reality from is this even, no age playing right now, or is this Chat GBT or something like that?
Right.
I mean, we're not far from that in certain things. I mean, you see how this stuff works when you can even, my friends in advertising are scared shitless because who's going to need copywriters and people to do these short videos and commercials for TV and the internet when you can suddenly just put in 5 keywords and the AI machine will give you, I don't know, what's his name? The Matrix movies or something like that. It'll spit out some sort of science fiction idea that could be sold by a movie studio. I mean, I think that's what the strike was about.
Somebody has to watch all this shit though too. I mean, is that going to serve as, what I mean? It's the same sort of idea now. I mean, you can just have a camera in the middle of the city filming it for, 24 hours, but is
anyone's watching it?
Is anyone watching that? I mean, we could do anything you want to do. I mean, you have unlimited pornography available at the click of a mouse. One of the great, sort of primal sort of forms of early entertainment. The oldest professional, this stuff. You know what I mean? But you can't. And I'm not going to say there's anybody watching. Of course they are, but it's not. You can't do it 24 hours a day. You know what I mean? You can't. I can't base your life on this. Just because it's there doesn't mean everyone's going to do it. I think there's a certain amount of this. It's just computers watching content made by other computers. You know what I mean? And it's counting your clicks or something. You're going to put something else in place. I don't know. I guess there's a certain Emperor's New Clothes feeling towards some of this stuff. You know what I mean? I think as it goes, it feels like it's going to be something much more innocuous, or something that there's a human element where, the idea of the uncanny valley just sort of strikes me in all of this stuff. It's even if you can't tell if it was made by a human, is that what?
No,
is it even what we're doing? I don't know. I'm so curious.
I think we're going to be fine. I think one analogy that would be a great way to wrap up today is I've seen that selling 1,000 books to people, where I've actually maybe even interacted with a couple hundred of them at a book fair, at an event, something like that, has had a way bigger cultural impact on that person with, the art I'm making with my friends than a picture of a book that I put on something that 100,000 people liked. And that the margins, like what I've told our investors since the beginning is, it's not how many books you sell anymore. It's how much you get paid for the ones that you do sell. And I think that kind of applies to any physical product now that you're making that's a creative object. Is like, the big numbers is almost like that will never work with this kind of post-digital age system. You're like, what if you look at some bands in the 90s and what they sold in physical product, it's fucking madness. Like that would never happen now. So why not just be happy with what does happen? And there is, an allegorical Ray Bradbury-esque, connotation here, which is that maybe in order for some of us to get through this, current dystopia of Trumpism and what's going on in the world, it's not going to be as extreme as people having to memorize an entire book at the end of Fahrenheit 451 in order to retain that knowledge and be able to tell that story, because it's been banned by, some dystopian society. It's just that there's going to be people who understand the authentic and what is real. And then there's other people who just don't care to bother. And I think, I used to have a class that I taught where you had to read these dystopian novels from the first part of the 20th century and then make an argument in essay form as to who is right. And for a lot of times, it was Orwell. And I think it's flipped. And I think the internet in the last 20 years have taught us that Huxley was right, in that sex and entertainment and technology and drugs are going to be such a distraction that like everything else will just go to complete shit. But there'll always be like some people who don't, yes, yeah, Brave New World. Yeah, I mean, and like Huxley was right. I mean, like, we're going to be distracted by sex and entertainment and just not even realize what's happening. It's not as severe as The Matrix, but you see it in the sort of indifference of half the country not really thinking that this is really an existential threat, even after January 6th, even after quoting Nazis, even after having a Madison Square Garden, rally on an anniversary of a Nazi rally from the 30s. I mean, they're not even hiding some of the stuff at this point, which you could fact check in real time. And yet half the country's kind of la-di-da about the whole thing. And I think it's just because they're into their sports team, they're into certain bands that they go see, they have a ritual with their friends, and they're so comfortable, we're to use Neil Postman's phrase, we're amusing ourselves to death, and that was sort of the plot of Brave New World, right? It's a sort of like, yes, it's sort of channeled through this notion of soma being this drug that's ever so powerful that can sort of, kind of keep us in a perpetual haze of inaction. But it is going to be like that. I mean, I think it already is. We just don't really see it. I mean, Terry Gilliam's Brazil is another example, which I think borrows some tropes from both 1984 and from Brave New World, which is a satire of the future, right? It's just like a bureaucratic nightmare where, you get the one number wrong on some chart and they execute you. Obviously it's not going to devolve into that. But I think we're already in it. And I think that's what's kind of crazy about it. And I think that's what's led to the successfulness of not just a bunch of movie franchises that sort of tap into this idea, but even Elon Musk, who has outed himself as a right-wing troll in the last 2 years since buying Twitter. There's red pill, blue pill as like a metaphor. And that's also Brave New World. I think, that I don't know the Wachowskis, but like I'm sure that they were borrowing from, Huxley's book and various other things in writing that script in the 90s. Which, of course, didn't even envision what we have now with AI. And it was sort of like hinting at this, in a very dystopian way. But I think, Station 11, which was turned into an HBO show, which is Emily St. John Mandel's novel, which is about like a group of artists in a post-apocalyptic world and musicians, like just sort of like, and, like finding a way to live in a like Mad Maxian, netherworld. I mean, even if it ended up becoming that, I'd still think I'd want to hang in there, as far as like, as long as my family was with me and I had some friends and we could go off and create our own society, it would be way more back to the land than I think the 60s look very quaint in regards to like what threat we're now facing, not just in the United States, but I'm sure you've noticed like, over the summer, we just avoided fascism taking over in France and the Tories getting in again in England, which would have been who knows what would have gone on. And then, we not to get geopolitical, but, there's other hotspots in the world where, there's 2 live wars, and there's probably going to be a third one in Taiwan very soon. And, this doesn't bode well historically. I'm not a historian by trade. I don't have a PhD, but I have done a lot of research into various movements and times in the 20th century. And, there's really no good outcome if there's several hot wars going on. So I hope we all bandy together today and come out, as a smarter country that can, I sort of go forward and not have, this thing where we're really trying to undo the progress of the last 100 years and put the power of society in the hands of people who are almost comic book villains. And it's weird how people can't even see it coming. But I think, the ecosystem of the internet and the way the news is distributed, to your point earlier about who has time with all their jobs to really even get into the weeds of what's really happening. You really have to follow this like a horse race politically if you really want to know what the policy issues are or what so-and-so believes about this or that, because it's so lost in the circus of it all. And I think we are amusing ourselves to death. I have set an alarm. I don't know if you do this, but with Instagram, a friend of mine who's a psychologist said, set an alarm and see how much time you're spending on this. And then when you realize that, then cut it by a third and then give yourself a timer and do that 2 or 3 times a week and check in with this stuff. Otherwise, stop doing all of it. And that happened about a year ago. And I think I've been able to finish like twice as much stuff because I myself, even being fastidious about, efficiency and getting like 20 books out a year, was finding myself like caving to this kind of stuff. And, I have an addictive personality. So of course I'm going to sit there for hours and not even realize what's going on. I've almost kind of like avoided that stuff because I know my personality type. And it's, I can't just smoke a cigarette every once in a while. It's an all or none. It's all or none thing for someone like me. I don't know if you're like that, Randy, but
I've met people like that. Yeah, I could say.
Yeah, and so if you have that, I think I've been hyper aware in a way that most people are maybe not about this stuff that you're talking about. Mainly too because I'm a parent, and so are you, and I'm trying to keep my kids off the screen as much as possible. And they really only have like an hour or 2 where they're allowed it. And then it really is like, go outside and play, kick a ball around. Here's some paper, draw. And just being mindful of that because you see how it's so easy to get busy and wrapped up in your own stuff. And just, it's so knee jerk to be like, here's the iPad,
of course.
And you almost have to actively force yourself to not take those shortcuts as a parent. And so we have double duty, I guess, right? From our friends that don't have kids and that we're trying to figure out our whole fucking thing every day and what makes sense and that of our, of our spouse. But then also like, how do we shield our kids so that they obviously have like a post-digital age upbringing, but we sort of pepper in those things that we had that we think helped shape, the taste that we have now and the sort of mindset that we have now and the creatively how we function, so that we can raise good human beings, and it's tough, man. I feel bad for, we have 2 and it's I don't know how people do it when they have 5, money, I suppose could help with nannies and also family members coming by, I suppose. But at the end of the day, you just got to invest the time. So I don't know. I hope that we end on a lighter note today, which I think we did. And I'm sorry if I went too many roller coaster rides on, my Monty Python mentality of where, I do tend to go off on tangents, but it does usually circle back around eventually.
This is great. No, it's been good. I had a feeling this is where this interview would go. Where do you want people to find you? Give the plugs. Where can people buy books from you directly? Where do you want people to go learn more?
I mean, hatandbeard.com is our website. I mean, buying all the books from us, obviously does wonders. But look, I also have my friend Mike Slack now selling books into indie stores. I'm, purposely curating every shop that sells our books, and we're going to be able to take over our Amazon stuff soon. So they're almost, really by January 1st, no matter where you're buying our books, obviously buying them direct is always going to help the artist the most, but it's not going to be as a divisive issue, hopefully. I mean, I think it took us 8 years to kind of figure out, like, how do you have an artist-friendly way to make books that kind of eschews this level of wastefulness and like capitalism? And it's certainly not perfect, and it's a balancing act. But I think, and then I'd say the biggest thing too is just, just come to our events. I think we program stuff all over the country. I think that's where I think I connect with people in the books that we're making the most effectively, because you got to come see the band or see the art or see the drawings or see the photographs. And the book is sometimes just the vehicle, Randy, like it's the consolation prize that you take home, but there's some other component to it. So thank you for having me on, and also for letting me sort of cue people up to, what it is that we do at Hat and Beard, and, and also how you can support the books that we're making.
It's great. Yeah. And we've got the holiday season. So go to the website, buy some books for yourself, buy some books for your friends. This is a great time for the gift of giving. It's nothing like, the joy of someone's face when you see them open up a book, especially if it's a good one.
Well, and I should plug this too, because it'll be a good thing for, your readership and listenership to take advantage of, which, if you use the code FRAMILY, which is friends and family, creating a new term. So I'm going to pronounce it FRAMILY.
Portmanteau.
Yeah.
Family.
Yeah. Then you save 30% on all the books.
Oh my God. Look at this.
Oh yeah. So if you,
if you're an hour and 20 minutes into this episode,
yes.
If you've made it this far, you deserve 30% off of hatandbeard.com. Family. Look at this. For the holidays, you cannot go wrong with that.
Yeah. And usually we only do a whisper campaign about that. But, Randy, you and I have such like kindred spirits. Like, the people, your listeners are our people, man. They're already friends and family. So, so yes, that's one way to always save. That works all the time. That code has been up for years. And
buy two. Now you're losing. Yeah. You're losing money if you don't buy more now. Now you got to buy more with that 30% off. That's very generous for the holidays. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, I'll have links down in the show notes. JC, thank you so much. I'm excited for all things coming. I think the future looks bright despite whatever is going on in the country today. Books are happening.
Yes. Yeah, yes. You just got to stay focused and, books, join the club. That's going to be the slogan, come next month. I just got to get through this election season, then people won't be as distracted. And, the book, we're not going to do a monthly book club. It's going to be quarterly, but it's going to be by genre. And so Beautiful. There'll be, I think that's sort of the next chapter, and then opening the bookstore gallery, which, I'll circle back to you with some notes you can put on the permanent notes of that later, which will happen in early 2025.
Love it. We'll have to maybe we'll do some live podcasting from the
We're definitely going to be doing that, man. So I think, that's going to be part 2, my friend.
Interact. Awesome. All right. Well, take care. Thanks, JC.
Thanks, brother.
Whoa. Wow. Thank you, JC, for coming on. I think we documented a time and place of that morning of the election. It's a different world. We'll see how it goes, but I think it's important to, vote with your dollar as much as you can, and, support the things you believe in, and support the artists and the outlets that these artists and creatives use to get their word out and to get their work out, whatever that is, wherever you find yourself being drawn to, supporting these creative outlets, whether it's publishers, record companies, venues, or even just the bands themselves, whatever you can do to support local artists, local musicians, local writers, do it. You're doing yourself a favor. You're doing them a favor, or you're supporting them. I don't know if it's necessarily a favor, but it's a beneficial thing for you and the creatives out there who need it now more than ever. Independent creative voices depend on patrons and people, who believe in the good work that they're doing and want to see them do more of it. So, take advantage of JC's very kind offer with a Framley code over at hatandbeard.com. And you can also follow him on the Instagram at Hat and Beard Press to see all the other upcoming books they have. The new Pulp book looks awesome. Gary Baseman is awesome. So many great things they have out already and then are coming out. So don't miss out on your chance to grab some really awesome music books and art books. And it's hatandbeard.com, code FRAMLY, like friends and family, FRAMLY. All right, I'll be back on Monday with Aaron Farley to talk more things about this interview and whatever the heck else happens between Thursday and Monday. We'll get into it. We'll chop it up, and you can always write us at, hyphenatehalftime@gmail.com, and find me on the Instagram also at Randy S. Randall. And yeah, I love hearing from everyone. I appreciate it. Keep on keeping on, and have a good weekend. Bye.
I've always worked in some sort of publishing apparatus that is part of the counterculture. And weirdly, it thrives when we have tyrannical governments, and, obviously that's a horrible thing to say and out loud, but it is kind of true.